nhớ rằng số lần sự tưởng để nó của nhà hóa nè cả rong xe trả tàu tôn chỉ này được sở hóa sở cho nó của bà thấy cái xe để nên sẽ đại diện chỉ sẽ kể nhớ cái nhớ rằng lúc đó của nhà trả lời nhện ra đã nên cho lùi chúa tuần gì tuần ít ra xa nhớ đó của nhà về điều họ cả thọ nên sẽ đại là còn kế lời rèn nó cũng tiếp theo. The opening of the forest held a stare that made Jailea's heart skip beats, and as she tried to control her breathing, her mind was racing with questions of what went wrong with Shuoking and how she was going to get him out. The past few days had been a hell ride, and due to the uphill climb, she threw her entire bag of clothes away to make it lighter for the horses to ride faster. She arrived wearing a torn dress, and her hair had been tangled so much from the wind's harsh whispers that it no longer had any silk strands. Lúc ở trong nó, như lúc ở trong tua, Hoa Tại Kia Tư sat beside her. Cô tháo câu rau cơ. Tì ra cả đời tôi trong một trẻ. Kia của mũi lần. Jialia felt a deep sadness enter her soul, and she realized that what she was feeling was the exact emotions Shuo King must have felt as he stood here. He had no choice, and was at his last resort. She pushed back her tears, and she knew that if she let all of the men here perish with her, there would be no saving Shuo King. She had to make a hard choice, and so she turned to the king, and with her most gentle smile, said, Hoa Tai Kia Tu, 我州的个这给路的说跟古人用中个政治木上路个。And with that, she kicked the horse the king sat on, and the animal roared, causing him to fall off as she rode into the opening of the forest without the men. She could hear the king's cry for her, but as soon as she entered, the portal closed, and she was alone. The horse's quiet breathing matched hers as she got off and began walking toward the light. She felt her hands begin to shake, and as she got closer to the light, she felt as if the atmosphere was beginning to change into something that made her hair rise. She tripped over a log and fell, her hands scraping against the hard earth, and when she finally got up, she saw blood had begun to ooze from the open wounds. A sound behind her caused her to turn, and she saw the green-blue pond with lilies around the edges. A deep fog began to rise, and the air got heavy, making her drowsy. She felt drawn to the water, and as she knelt down beside it, she saw her reflection and peered in, only to have two pair of hands with dark claws reach for her and pulled her in. The jasmine smell woke Jialia, and she sat up, realizing she was cleaned, bathed, and dressed in a blood-red gown with rich textiles of gold, and dangling from her ears were jade earrings. Her hair had been washed, braided, and coiled on her head. She saw her clothes she'd worn neatly piled together, and she searched through her boot to find the dagger her father had given her. She pulled it out and stuck it behind her in the folds of the cummerbund. All around her was an exquisite taste of luxury, and she pushed open the door to find a man wearing all black sitting at a very long table with a cup of ale in his hands. His eyes widened, and a grin appeared on his face as he stood and reached her in 3 strides. Oh, Min Jialia, "Có sợ là lo," he said in a gentle tone. "Jay có trai pla hình bò." And then he clapped his hands, where servants began bringing in food to place on the table. He reached out a hand to touch her, and she backed away. "Cây lên từ," she asked. "Ô sao sao mua mà lo? Cô ya hóa tại mình mua. Lúc vào lúc chuyện là của lúc. Lo thả khe của xe của bà tổ có lì cả." He offered a hand to her, and she thought for a moment before she took it. But as soon as she did, she saw that the hands were dark claws. The same dark claws she remembered had pulled her into the water. She gasped and let go instantly, moving away, putting distance between them. Cái tôi cho cô là sao? Bây giờ cô đi chào Shuo King了, she asked. Smiling, he replied, Shuo King. Oh, cái tôi đi Shuo King lo? Yeah, cái cô sao cô tôi chỉรู้了. His face broke into a sad expression, and he put his hands together, his smile no longer gentle. Cũng cho cái tôi xia. Sure King như chỉ thấy khó đã chỉ cho hạt tía có yếu tố sai nữa đó cú li à. Cơ bà sao bỏ nữa mà. Cũng mà chắc có một sai nữa là tao cơ. Upon hearing this, she followed the king into a darkened room where a fire was burning with red flames. A moldy smell hit her nose, and she saw women wearing green gowns that were revealing and long, gathering around a center that had a bed. The king shouted, and the woman began to move away, showing that it was Shokeng, who lay in bed with a woman in his arm. But the man she saw looked nothing like her husband. He was there all right, but his face was cured of his scars, and he had a wicked grin on his face. He pushed the woman in his arm away and stood up, his eyes holding a dark look. Shocking. The king asked. Shocking took one look at her and then laughed. Jialia's heart broke at that, and she ran to him, holding his arm. Shocking. He looked her up and down, and then an emotion crossed his face, and he removed her hand from his arm. Kaya lang tina, lang tika ka to ko. Bây ka to chỉ tấm na ka ku chỉ to ka kan ko na. Frowning, Jialia reached for him again, and this time he shoved her off. She fell to the ground as he bent down and tilted her chin with his finger. Bỏ nè đã chỉ catch bỏ chạy đi. Lang tia te ka chỉ to ko na. Ka chỉ ha ku nhẹ na. Catch bỏ so you lu mang mo liao. He stood and began walking away as Jialia pushed herself to a standing position. Shocking? Ka hai chỉ li có na. Ku ya ka tu ta ra na. Ka te ku ya ching ka. Ya li kya lu ka la. Ti la sai ku. He turned around and glared at her. Ta ra. She nên no ya te ku chang toi tu rong li ka lo ku ta ra man che ku su no cho to. Ka to na ya to la chi na. Ku yin chỉ bao ka te tia. Sai ya chỉ ho ta nhẹ ka ne ke. Ka ma mu kong nu cha. De ku mo tu rong la. He opened his arms, and the woman dressed in green came running into them. Jialia felt hot tears stream down her face as she rushed to stop the woman, but he shoved her off and threw one over his shoulder, carrying her off. Jialia let out a scream as the king helped her stand up. He gently said as he brushed her tears away. La Chi tao. Cú xin chân hai tia số cái nhớ chính cho cú lợ. Nhưng nhưng mà đã chỉ trừ xì lợ sư. Cú thọ có gì hóa tài. Thọ có khay cú xe. Cú nhập bắt tao nửa lý chẳng. Grinning, he replied. Thọ cú thiệt tao nửa. Nửa những chỉ thả ít lọ sơ có lý à. Có khay cú sọ. Trao nửa có gia lăng tư nọ. Cú nhớ nửa tụ ta ra. Gia lý ô cha nửa họ chỉ báo con mà. Jialia broke down and began to cry. The image of Shurka carrying another woman burned her mind, and jealousy ached her soul. Nhưng nhau lý giả nửa là sư. Cú yêu chú cho cả tao nửa đặc ăn thôi của mù. Nửa chỉ báo cả nà. À, ô lý nào mà dọ. Cân thật của nhau áp bên nữa ế. Cú mà lý xua để xế của nhập bá tao lý giả nà. Ô lý lá. Ô lý kia mà dọ.
Said you needed a break and left with no heads up. I was strong for your sake, but it made my heart.
Jialia could hear the sound of the woman's laughter all around her, and she put her hands over her ears. It was burning into her mind, and she couldn't stop crying. The moment Shuoking denied her kept replaying in her head, and all she could do was sob. The king left her after dinner, and she was alone with her thoughts, which made it worse. She took it upon herself to try to seek where Shuoking had ran off to, but had found nothing. There were so many rooms, and the sounds of the woman's laughter was now closer than before. Standing up, she shoved her hands across her cheeks and ran out into the hall where Shuoking was sitting with a few women around him. The same dark glare was in his eyes as he watched her make her way into the hall. He waved his hand, and the woman left as he straightened and cleared his throat. Without the scars on his face, he was extremely handsome. So handsome that it hurt to look at him. Chỉ hốt tài mình mua sải bánh nhẹ là cả lũ và tuôn chỗ nó ấy ở nhà nó sải con nó. Cứ bảo là chỉ rong sao có. Cũng chỉ có mà rong lấy cái tiền to. Chỉ nhau ấy tư nhẹ hốt tài có tư liệu, he said with a sneer. Jialia tried to control her tears. Kasatia ko to silo ni hotay na lang. Yeah, di ka ni chiyay to ne ko pao le ne. Chili ka to wala chin na ma. Ta kya na to chi mo bai to itu pa ne jong le ka. Ka lu ra ta tam bao. Yon den che ka chen ye wo ko ba ko che lo te ba. That last line did it for her, and she screamed, running to him, flinging her arms at him. He caught her by the wrists and stood up, pushing her back as she began crying. Shocking! Dạo lý giả đó có lợ. Cơ tư có cụ tố có lần bề rong kia tham bảo lý nó. Ê ô chá có chuyện kỳ sao cụ thịa. Lực tư lý giả đó có nạ. Sợ lắm à, she cried. He shoved her off and brushed his tunic with his fingers. Cụ chỉ tao có tố có lần bề có tư lý nà mò. He turned to go, and then she cried out. Giờ có kỳ sao cụ lợ. Chạy tao hay tiết có chỉ lúc cụ lợ nó bùi à. So ya có thể cụ ưu trì là cho ta nó. Có như chuyện cái khó đã chuyện đi lắm. Cơ tư cho lưu hai tìa. Giờ đến bảo tư, chân đến bảo lý giả. Có ý lần tư lý bùa tao cụ sơ. His hands turned into fists, and he turned to look at her. Tê lù có chỉ một chân. Lần tì hiểu cho lù chúa lý con cho con à. Có sĩ sáy có tụ khen, lọ cho cụ sáy ư sĩ dở là đến bộ lý tử. He turned and left the room. Jialia broke down and began crying. She felt the cloak around her shoulders, and turned to find the king smiling beside her. Ah, tụi mình đang rong cao. Sao kỳ sao tụi xia. Kia cũng mà sao có lúc có mua. Sao là cụ trúc tệ. He said as he helped her stand up. Cũng mà bác à. Kia ước ô lý nó. Cú luôn tu nó nhưng chỉ mới tu nè hóa tài là cả tia. Cú chừng to hai tia, giờ có lỡ của tu nè hóa tài là tây giờ số kinh nhớ trả căn cho tao cả. Kia ư xí li nó sẽ nữ bộ sợ là bóc cả lỡ. Cứ bà sa còn tên nó cô. She frowned and began backing away. Cứ hai đã chỉ li có. Cú chừng cả xia. He took her hand and held it tightly. Còn tên nó cú hai tia ư xí sẽ số kinh ô tia là nữa đà. Giờ nữa đà xứ nữ của yếu có. Nếu chủ sợ là bác có. Bây giờ. Cơ sở lý cả. Cứ bà sai còn tên đó cũ trước cả tao có tụi mình gì ta có lòng mà. Jialia wiped her eyes and turned to look at the direction where Shokin had disappeared to. There was a dark cloud in his eyes whenever she looked at him, and it was that same dark cloud that was in the king's eyes right now. Something wasn't right, and she had to figure out how to bring her husband back. She turned around to glance at the king, whose face was written with hope. She let out a shaky breath. They'd been through so much together, and this tribulation was about to end their struggle. She had to be strong. She had to fight to bring him back, even if it meant giving up her life. Oli si hotai. Kukung tay na ko.
Said you needed a break and left with no heads up. I was strong for your sake, but it made my heart drop.
The veins inside Shokeng's arms were inflamed again, and he felt the heat spread throughout his body. He hadn't felt this much pain since his father had scarred him as a child. His body was reacting differently, and the past few days had been like a whirlwind of torture. He kept seeing himself chasing a woman with no face. It had frightened him to the core, and he'd waken up in a sweat, surrounded by strange images in his mind. He couldn't figure out what had happened, and there was a strange fog in his head where he didn't know what led him to this place. He woke up, remembering his father's last words, that they were heading to a place far up north to sign a treaty to prevent war. But he'd woken up alone, and with a king whose eyes held too much distrust. He never went anywhere without Gongchi, and now even the man was nowhere to be found. He needed to figure things out for himself, and then arrived the woman who claimed to be his wife. He hadn't been too sure what that was about, but he knew that he would never have picked her to be his wife. For one, she was too weak, and he didn't like weak women. But something about her voice seemed to awaken a deep trust in his heart. It reminded him of how it used to feel when his mother would hold him. The pain made him stand and grit his teeth as he shoved both his hands through his hair, pulling the strands to keep from groaning. The next blinding pain sent him on his knees, and he saw again the same woman from his dreams running away. He couldn't remember her name, and yet somehow it felt as if he had always known her from somewhere. He cursed, and pulled himself together as the pain finally subsided, and he stood up. He shoved the door open to find water from the dining hall, and instead found her, the woman called Jialia, sitting on the king's lap. The image made his heartbeat quicken, and he didn't know why. Something about this seemed wrong. "Zihuatai," he said as he approached them. "Có, cụ lưu trong trong ya la shi shai na. Ba kong u na ma sho keng. Tu na yo ya ku tu ta sha." The moment the king said that, the same blinding light slammed his head and he began coughing. The woman had a strange look in her eyes, almost like concern for him, as he pulled himself together. "Zhou he managed to say. The moment the king put his hand around her waist, Shokeng felt a hot heat spread throughout his body. The emotion in her eyes told him she was not comfortable, and when the king leaned against her to kiss her, his hand holding the table snapped the corner off. This caused all of them to stop, and he dropped the material to the ground where it clattered loudly. The king pushed the woman off and looked at the broken table. "Shokeng." "Nuna ya uli color?" the king asked. He had no answer. He just looked away. "Zhongli guchi sineng." "Yaka, vika ototeya chitongche tomo. Kasa sa te kuya chaka muyongi." "Dozi!" The guards came and the king smiled. "Diashoke mu dozi. Yanu chi toi chi jiang day." Jialia could hear the whip and a lost count of how many times it had hit her husband's flesh. She stopped counting after 20, and she had covered her ears and began sobbing. He had stopped making sounds not too long ago, and she had heard the guards drag him into a room. She was waiting until everything was silent before making her way there to see. The hallway was dimly lit with torch flames, and it was easy to spot which chamber he was in due to the bloody mess the guards left behind. She quietly opened the door, and there lay on the ground her husband. His back was torn open with whip lashes, and blood had seeped out a pool onto the ground. She closed the door and dropped to her knees, her heart breaking as she took the blanket and began tearing it to clean up his wound. He wasn't moving, but she could see that he was still breathing. "Shokeng, kuluka," she whispered. "Shola, kuyataka takamuche, uyamupi iluneng. Sholama." This reminded her of when his blood had stained her dress before, and she had cried so hard thinking she'd lost him. She used too much pressure on her wound, and he woke from the pain, his body thrashing against the ground. He reached up and grabbed her wrist, pulling her down to his eye level. "Kaya lang titia?" he asked through gritted teeth. "Shokeng, kuya ka tu tasha. Soyanda ku, yakatu." And she bent down and kissed his bloody lips. The door opened and the king roared loudly as he reached down and grabbed her by the throat, bringing her up. She began choking as he slammed her body against the wall. Shokeng muttered a few words as he tried to push himself up to help her. She now saw the demon before her, and he was squeezing the life out of her.
Cái xã tình chế cái tàu có tụi mình số kinh cả ana ba. Chỉ tàu dùng nhiều cái xã.所以呀，这样的个不他妈绿豆的绿了。你以前家干的其实个了啊。自己弄那么，也个人我骨头，结果也见我那样。
The king said. His skin began to darken and his eyes began to bulge. The fear in Jialia broke free and she screamed as he laughed and his forked tongue came out to lick her across the cheek.
你也经常搞你干嘛子下的呀？
He cried. "Shokeng," she cried. "Sholana!" The king laughed wickedly as he said,
个对面小经嘅是包个啦。你对个碌两人仔嘛，你嘛早记到个了。
The king wrapped both his hands around her neck and felt her vision fade. And then her father's words came into her mind. "Yatao she got saw she got tu." The dagger. The dagger. Where was the dagger? She reached behind her and pulled it out from the cummerbund around her waist. She brought it out, and the king's eyes widened as she slammed it into his chest. He let his hands around her neck go, and she deepened the knife in. When he roared with pain, his eyes turned green and his tongue lashed out at her, causing her to fall to the side. She heard another groaning and turned to find her husband thrashing with his hands around his head, his veins inflamed to the point of bursting. She rushed to his side and picked him up, holding him in her arms. "Shokeng!" she cried. She was plucked by the neck, and her body hit the wall as the king glared at her with a half-hanging jaw.
个啥啥的，我要多容易。 有主要我的大家生在你大。
Jagumu, she cried. The king opened his mouth to speak when an arrow pierced through his head. Jialia watched with horror as her husband slowly came into view from behind the king. Nyonda tena, ku ilang tili kidon Jialia. Lutu neng jongla jaitia, doku samudate. As the king gagged, Shoking punched his fist into the king's chest and pulled out his beating heart. The king's body shriveled and turned into ashes as he squeezed the heart until it burst into pieces, covering both him and Jialia in a bloody rain shower. 我叫那时候正地了讲，叫lui chúa tuần diễn, cụ bà tới kia xia tiền nên sẽ đầu giờ mua kia là dạy tuần nên đâu cũng lông ra đã nâng là thia, bé mà lấy sinh trí đầu tuần chúa nè mà.
Said you needed a break and left with no heads up. I was strong for your sake, but it made my heart dry.